Thank you very much. How do you follow Paul and Arlene? That was fantastic. I even want to go back to college and do that module. So when Michael put out a call for philosophy and social work, I kind of jumped at this opportunity. Basically, my background is I'm a senior medical social worker over here in the northeast of Ireland. So I cover Dundalk East, which is a double sector. And I suppose a lot of my practice is framed by a feminist ethic of care in terms of what I do. But this work kind of stemmed from my time when I worked in Ireland's National Forensics Mental Health Services, and I worked with a population of men mainly with autism and ID, and I set up the social work service within that. Before they had a social work service, but they never really had a dedicated social work. So within that, I applied a lot of what I hope to discuss today was a lot of feminist ethics of care for men who came to Dundrum Central Mental Hospital. And there's three routes. So I'll briefly describe what they are. And then I'm going to talk about one population where probably this resonates with people who are sent under the Civil Mental Health Act for special treatment and care. So the word care is really important to me as a social worker. And feminism problematize care through an ethics of care. What is it? How is it done? What drives it? And in a sense, when you're sent to Dundrum Central Mental Hospital, care is supposed to be part of that experience in a forensics mental health setting. And I'm sure, much like England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, in forensic services, up to only recently, care would have been a sort of a reference in a policy, a reference in a model of care, but actually in practice, it was more coercion, punishment. So myself as a social worker, a male social worker, espousing the principles of feminist ethics of care and patient outcomes, you can imagine it brought up some very interesting conversations. People wanted, but it was very interesting 3 years. But I've applied the same now to my practice in the community. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Michael. So just the outline, just give you a brief overview of forensics mental health in Ireland. There's only one forensics hospital and two pieces of legislation. I'm going to look at the Civil Mental Health Act patients and try to identify care within the legislation and what that means to Central Mental Hospital. An overview very briefly of our integrated social care in mental health services and actually compare it to how it applies to the UK. Just talk about feminism and mental health social work. And I think a lot of the previous presenters have lined this sort of piece up very well. So I'll briefly talk about it. And then I'm just going to say how I use Joan Toronto's ethical care framework for my social work practice, which and Paul and Arlene touched on this, in terms of a lot of students I take, I do emphasize ethics of care, and they really struggle with this. I consistently get students from most Irish universities, and I have one from Robert Gordon. And it's their lack of understanding of feminist ethics, feminism, feminist ethics of care and patient outcomes, which is really depressing. And then I'll just show a case example of how I apply this ethics of care framework to a patient outcomes for Civil Mental Health Act patients. So hopefully it'll make sense. So next page, please, Michael. So basically, the Central Mental Hospital was back in our colonial times, was set up in the 1850s. It was outside South Dublin. Victorians put it out there, very much like an asylum, space and seclusion. There was talk at its fairly sort of development that it would co-locate with our prison services. But thankfully, Victorians at the time in Ireland said, no, we'll keep it separate. And there has been many conversations about whether you link forensic mental health services on prison sites, but thankfully that's never really happened. And really, if you go to Central Mental Hospital, you've got three routes. One is a Civil Mental Health Act process, which I'll talk about. The other one is if you're a prisoner and you have mental health difficulties and need a period of treatment. Or the other one is you commit a crime and found not guilty by reason of insanity, and you're sent for what we would describe as to be provided with care and treatment. Now, when you work in the place as a social worker, your view of what care and treatment is and what is actually provided as care and treatment are poles apart. Next slide, please. So basically, the mental health law in Ireland, it's a very simple law, and it's quite progressive to a degree. But in Mental Health Act, the word treatment. So if you're sent to Dundrum Central Mental Hospital as a Civil Mental Health Act patient, so you're down in a local hospital in Kerry and you're behavioural issues, complex issues, you're sent to Dundrum for a period of what we call special treatment. So the definition of treatment includes care and rehabilitation. Okay? So you are being transferred for a period of time to Dundrum for care and rehabilitation. It's a special form of treatment. Okay? So under Section 21 of our Mental Health Act, that covers the transfer by a clinical director to another approved centre. And in Section 21(2)(a), if the clinical director feels you need what is special treatment but not defined as special treatment, you're then transferred to Central Mental Hospital for a period of time. So that's the legal framework of how a Civil Mental Health Act patient, and the type of patient will be, somebody with chronic schizophrenia and a lot of violence and aggression, or often in the unit I worked in, you've got a mental health and intellectual disability or a neurodevelopmental disability, and you're challenging to the community. You've had multiple admissions to the approved centre, and then somebody says, well, why don't we get him up to Dundrum? And you could be Kerry and you could be sent to Dundrum, and you could, and you have, and I have seen, you could be what technically should be 6 months. You could be there for up to 12 years. So the issue of care and sort of conceptualizing what care is, the ethics of care framework is a really good way to problematize care within a forensics mental health setting and to advocate. And that really is primarily what my role as a social worker is, to advocate, to agitate. But it's very difficult within a forensics mental hospital because risk is constantly thrown back at you. So that's sort of in keeping in line with feminism. I'm sort of trying to problematize, yes, they're sent for care and rehabilitation, but in reality, what they get is coercion and deprivation of liberty. And that's my sort of standpoint. So the next slide there, please. So Ireland has we are going for an integrated health and social care approach through Sláinte Care. So sharing the vision is the mental health sort of policy framework, and that really looks at a stepped care approach that's integrated. And then our individual care plan is you're supposed to legally have one when you're in an approved centre, or if you're transferred to Dundrum, you're supposed to have one. But in reality, a lot of this is policy based. So if I go to somewhere like Scotland or Northern Ireland, England, and Wales, from the table, you can clearly see that there is an integrated approach in legislation. It's not perfect. I worked in England. I know it's not perfect. But you can see that social care is legislated for, integrated care is legislated for. For a social worker working in Dundrum, you're going on policy. You're going on people's charity, really, within the health service. Oh, yeah, we'll give him a place here. Oh, well, we won't. So you really don't have that sort of legal framework to argue for the social care outcomes. You don't really, you're definitely healthcare. But when it comes to social care or just basic care in the community, it's very much towards a paternalistic type of medical model. Now, it's still very, it's not all doom and gloom, but you can see if you're somewhere else and you had a legal framework to define social care, well, then you could push that sort of that need for care that is bespoke, that is individual, that's person-centered, human rights. So the next slide, please. So really, as I said earlier, feminism, while it looked at the importance of social, political, and economic structures that shape human societies, particularly from a female perspective, it also looks at basic human rights. And so what we know is we can learn from women's experiences and feminist ethics to really challenge people who are in settings like a forensics mental health setting that are dominated and do experience inequality. I suppose another part to feminism is that whole human connection and relationship based. So instead of an ethic of justice that looks at the individual and their sort of issues, In feminism, you're looking at interdependencies and the relationship. So it's a really good framework for me to critically reflect about social work and how, and I think the previous presentation showed that within sort of the relationships, listening, non-judgmental, all of those key parts, it can be applied to mental health settings and a forensics mental health setting. So next slide, please. And I'm sort of repeating myself here again. So feminism and social work practice. Now, I always find as a male social worker and really what we would call a whisk, white, heterosexual, Irish settled Catholic, that is who I am. And that is, so when you go to talk about feminism, people look at you and kind of go, hello, what are you talking about, Aiden? But it's more about what parts of feminism, well, can you draw on to be part of your social work practice? So, I mean, very much social work and feminism, we have a lot in common: empowerment, challenging domination, subordination, which I felt, if you're a Civil Mental Health Act patient in the Central Mental Hospital, that you were experiencing this. Strong emphasis on power of mutual relationship. The big thing for me at the start in forensics was the risk and how your relationship was, just to be careful in that relationship with a patient who were dangerous. But actually, I found there was different ways of establishing that relationship and still acknowledging, there was an element of danger, element of risk, but there was also an element of citizenship that I needed to respect. There was empathy towards the individual who may have, pre-index offence, may have experienced a lot of health inequalities and discrimination and stigma. And so within that relationship, that's what feminism opens up for social work and a forensics mental health. And once again, it's not one directional. I'm not telling the patient they have to do A, B, and C. It's bi-directional. I'm learning from them. And hence the title, Lost Tomorrows and Forgotten Years, or Forgotten Yesterdays. It really was sort of these men's lives where they weren't seen by just the incidents that brought them to the hospital. They were children. They were kids. They were partners. They had relationships, and we should be working towards establishing those relationships. But we needed to work with the individual and look at how we could promote their well-being, citizenship, and feminism was a really good framework for that in terms of my social work. Next slide, please. So, in a previous life, I was a PhD student in UCL, exploring caring masculinities of Irish fathers of children with a disability. And when I started off, I was looking at Foucault and Bourdieu in terms of power relationships, but actually what I was really studying was care. And I came across Joan Toronto's and Carol Gilligan's, and this was an amazing change in terms of how I practice social work. But Joan Toronto's work really sat well with me in terms of my attentiveness about supporting somebody, my responsibility to respond to their needs, the competence, what would I need to know and do to support that person, but to also advocate for that person, and responsiveness to their needs. So I felt those ethical elements, her four ethical elements framework, was a really good guide to frame my social work practice. It really moved away from what we would, in forensics, maybe an ethic of justice, victims of crime, keeping community safe. I was going along with the course of society because of these risk assessments. I was part of the problem. So by drawing on Joan Toronto's work, it got me to rethink my social work practice, not to apply it in a way that was part of the pathway through the hospital, and where the blockages came, which I hope to identify in my example, was to challenge it and not do it in a way that's naively, challenge it in a way that empowering the patient to know what the HCR20 meant for them and how they could challenge some of the risk assessments from that. But at the same time, to educate them on what was their areas of learning too. I felt Joan Toronto's was very good. So the next slide here is as they say in Father Ted, I did something mad there, Ted. Uh, I said, okay, I've got these 4 principles. What do I actually do in this workplace? Am I just somebody who goes out and gets the social welfare? And I said, no, let's go back to the basics. Well, I'm a human rights practitioner, although the legal the lawyers would like to remind that they were the human rights advocates. My work is relationship based. There's a very strong link between strengths based approaches within mental health settings, whether it be a forensics or community, trauma informed. To acknowledge trauma, we've seen a lot of domestic violence, gender-based violence, violence within the home, and look at disability, ethnicity, and culture. And in the previous speakers, they talked the travellers. It was quite interesting to see how travellers and Roma, people with a disability, and their offending behaviour was constructed. So then I kind of tried to cross-reference, like what would I look at? So human rights attentiveness, structural barriers. And I'm going to talk that in the next slide. Equality, legal literacy. So to a degree, when it came to legal literacy, I was known for when we had the grand rounds on every Monday morning, people would say, well, we've bed blockages, and I would turn around and I say, well, what about the Civil Mental Health Act patients? And clinical director used to get really annoyed with me because he would say, well, they can't go back. And I said, well, they haven't been properly reviewed by their local community services in over 6 years. So there was bits of that where you'd advocate in terms of both the structural barriers and the legal literacy, and also citizenship when it comes to people's human rights and length of stay in the forensics hospital. So I kind of boiled it down to 5 key themes. A feminist approach to psychiatric services. There are elements of Joan Toronto's work that we can work alongside in terms of everyday practice. The principle of reciprocity. Why would you send somebody to the most restrictive, outside of prison in Ireland? Forensics is the most restrictive care setting with a legal framework. But why would you send them up there? And it became very obvious. They weren't being sent for care and rehabilitation. They were being sent for coercion and containment and, get them out of Kerry sort of thing, send them to Dublin. So there was the principle of reciprocity, which is a psychiatric sort of principle, putting that back to the psychiatrist. Like, what are we doing here? The supported decision making. What is it that the patients, are they involved in making these choices? Health inequalities and exclusion from local service. So if you're a Civil Mental Health Act patient from Kerry, you're in Dublin and nobody from Kerry was coming up. And I was saying to my principal social worker and to the clinical director, I said, we need to raise safeguarding concerns here. And I was constantly being shot down. But, never give up. You keep, by driving the health inequalities and the policies, we were able to move 6 out of 12 patients, albeit not to the ideal places, but to private providers, where the lads' social care needs were the primary driven outcomes and not containment and coercion in Dundrum. And then making safeguarding personal. We still struggle in Ireland with safeguarding, but by making it personal, we were able to say, look, at these people's rights are being deprived. Their 7 years technically was the length of care and rehabilitation, but if you're there 14 years, you have to ask questions. So the next slide, please. So if I go to team 4, and I'll come back to the legal definition of a transfer of a Civil Mental Health Act patient, it's bloody blah, 21, you're in Drogheda and Drogheda can't contain you, so you want to go to a more restrictive setting. Under the Mental Health Act, you'd use Section 21 to send them to maybe a rehabilitation unit under the Mental Health Act. But Section 21 2A1 talks about special treatment, and that's care and rehabilitation to the Central Mental Hospital. But once again, that's not definite. So Section 21.4 talks about you're still a patient of the approved centre you're transferred from. So by looking at that, I apply the ethical care principle of competence, being legally literate, to every care review and every mental health tribunal raising this point. The ethical care principle of attentiveness, being attentive to structural barriers. The fact they weren't coming from Kerry to review and look at alternative, least restrictive settings and be moved back in, I was holding the HSC, my employers, to account. Now, that was a very uncomfortable place because you were seen as the problem. But what I was doing was problematizing care, the lack of care, questioning what was the special treatment goals here, and bringing that to the mental health. So that's what really drove that got 6 out of 12 patients moved from Dundrum to supportive social care settings. And the principle of responsiveness, so shared decision making. So once again, it wasn't unidirectional. I wasn't assessing the patient. I was now giving the patient the tools to understand what the risk assessments were, and giving them voice to challenge, and allowing them not to say I need to leave the hospital, but every time they had a mental health review board or tribunal, because we're Civil Mental Health Act patients, that they could question the tribunal. Well, why can't I go back, and why aren't I seeing my local community mental health team? So I was literally putting us under pressure. So I was being responsive to their needs. So I was really probably the most unpopular social worker in there. The outcome was 6 out of 12 patients. We 12 patients. 11 of them had discharge plan pathways, and over the course of it, 6. And it was a really interesting change in the culture, because it wasn't just a one discipline, it became interdisciplinary. So nurses, occupational therapists, and even senior registrars on rotation began to support the argument for care in the least restrictive setting. And when I left after 3 years, because there's only so much you can do of this work, I left kind of reflecting back. And when Michael called for this type of presentations, I left kind of being reassured that when I didn't get my PhD in an ethic, what I learned in my time in UCL and what I applied in my social work practice and what I do on a day-to-day basis, it's small gains. It's not seen, but it's. I really wish students could engage with philosophy, and educators could engage with philosophy and show the power that it can bring to social work. And I'm very conscious that I'm an advocate of feminist ethics of care. I'm an ally, but what I can bring is can bring change. It's not a Big Bang theory, but you can change cultures, and that's what I would like to contribute to today's debate. That an ethic of care, it was quite revelatory for me in terms of how I practice. It allowed me to be vulnerable. It allowed me to talk in a way that I felt confident about, not knowing everything all the time, but knowing I was doing it under a framework that listened to people, that engaged with what the person wanted, and I felt was good social work practice. That's who I am, and that's how I try to make sense of philosophy and social work for today's conference. Probably waffled. There you go, lads. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aiden. I think that was a really different way of talking about philosophy and social work than probably me and Martin did, certainly. And it was just really good to hear how you can use the philosophy in practice. And some of the things that you were saying really kind of like made me think about the presentation we did and how they come together and dovetail. And that was really useful, actually, I think.
It's incredible when you come across your peers, and most people know me on Twitter, Aiden O'Cuna, and it's almost like you can't have these conversations in Irish social work practice. You can't have it with Irish social work educators. It's almost like Coru, like we have Coru the same way we have Social Work England, and it's like I feel like pardon my Anglo-Hibernians, like fuck the system. We're regulated to the point that we can't talk about this. Like genuinely, students have a freak when they're with me because this is not what we're. I said, fuck the system, lads. This is what we're. And I'm sorry if I say it, but that's an Anglo-Hibernian ism.
I support you completely, Aiden.
But it is, and we have so much to learn from women, and women's experiences. And Ireland's changing, and I'm part of the old guard. I'm sort of one of these dinosaurs, the whisk. But Ireland's changing, and I really wish social work had changed to kind of say, you know what, And this is why this is just so, it's just beautiful. I just love this. I could spend 4 days with you people.
Well, thank you. That was really, really powerful, I think. And one of the things that I think was really good, which we didn't talk about in our presentation, but we do, students who are here who've been taught by me have heard this. I think it's really good to be able to really take a feminist approach, feminist ethics, and apply it to things. Now, look, you've done it here with the Irish system and the institution. We talked about it at some length in one of the modules that I taught, applying feminist ideas to how child protection social workers in particular deal with domestic violence and how women and mothers are treated in that way, in a very risk-averse way that becomes incredibly oppressive. And I think those things just link, they're there with you, they're there with us. And a feminist approach just shows us a completely different way of being able to do it. I think that was really interesting. Thank you very much, Aidan.
Thank you.
I think it was really good. We've gone slightly over the time again, but then all my lectures do. No matter what, so everything else I do. Are there any questions, comments for Aidan before we have a quick break? Arlene, if you're talking, you're on mute again, I think. Sorry.
No, we're literally just sort of saying about what you just said, Aidan, about the authority, the regulators and their comments. So that's what we're just,
Right.